What's up, investors? You're watching the Chain Trends Crypto Podcast. I have a very special guest with me today named Dewdney. He's the founder and CSO of a very exciting and ambitious project called the Kylin Network. For my audience, I hope to be an introductory, for my audience or for anybody to ever watch it and really learn what this project is trying to do and how important I think decentralized data is. So I just would like to start, Dylan, if you would just tell us a little bit about your background and what led you to starting this project.
Yeah, and really appreciate that you've taken an interest in the project and that we have the platform to discuss with your audience and you about what we're up to and why we're passionate about it. In terms of my own background, um, I was really invested in ideas about social movements throughout history as a young man, um, going through the sociology program at Western University. Um, and I worked on my undergrad, my master's, both in sociology, and just really always extremely curious about all of the things that we kind of like, I will say, would take for granted about society, right? Like, why is society the way it is? Going all the way from, you know, politics to financial structures to even the buildings we build and the architecture that we see around us. It's all informed by a lot of this, what I would almost call like a taken for grantedness, and that is always informed a lot of my curiosity about the world. Why is the world the way it is? And so
Right.
when I left my master's and got into and it got into eventually got into the corporate world. Kind of like I got into it. I would say not by I wouldn't say by choice, sort of like feeling like I had to.
Right.
And during this time period, which would have been around like 2009-ish, 10-ish, and into 11 and 12, I just invested myself pretty much in doing these omnibus tours of the internet that would last hours. Sometimes they'd go down really interesting paths, sometimes they'd go down weird paths, and sometimes they'd go down productive paths. And
Wow.
um, and so I'd find myself like 3 hours later knowing some survey level of field that I didn't know before, which would be like it could be as esoteric as cryptozoology and learning about the Mongolian deathworm, or it could be as or as like I guess to the fore for our discussion, as interesting as coming across the Bitcoin white paper, which was what happened on one of these omnibus tours of the internet, and it was around late 2010, and I initially didn't. I wasn't like seriously into it at that point, but it nevertheless was like kind of primed and seated in my head for a little while, so that when I was re-exposed to it in late 2011, I definitely kind of reverted back, and I was like, okay, I really dove deeply into it, into reading every aspect of the white paper that I could, and really understanding it. I think at a much deeper level, and then all of my sort of sociology background had informed this desire to understand how society could be changed in a really significant and fundamental and foundational way. At the same sort of fundamental level as societal changes throughout history, of going from, for example, narratives around free markets, narratives around communism, being ascendant or descendant throughout time, or just narratives about feudalism going back even farther, right? Like, how does society really fundamentally change through ideas or technology, or the pairing of ideas and technology? And so I was like, okay, well, this seems to be, and just to frame this, this was around the time of like the financial crisis of 2008, and it was really subsequent to it. And so I think for a lot of us who were in, who were growing up as young people during that time, that had a real impact on them, understanding that, this sort of like system that we have was breaking down, and that a lot of the kind of like uh, a lot of the things that we take, again, harkening back to taken for grantedness, this taken for grantedness that, money is like this finite thing, it's a zero sum thing. Well, how could that be true if we just printed a whole bunch of it,
Right.
right?
Mhm.
um and so really primed for that message. And then I guess just jumping all the way to a year ago, I got progressively involved in crypto. And initially, sure, that was in Bitcoin. Those were the days of Bitcoin and blockchain. There was no difference. Bitcoin was blockchain, blockchain was
Right.
Bitcoin. There were, derivative color coins and things like that. Um, and then I'm in Toronto, so I got I was exposed to the Ethereum community really, really early and took part in their ICO, and um, was a fervent supporter of Ethereum and still am. And yeah, and then that allowed me a little bit of flexibility and freedom, and just got more and more involved. On the outside for a long time, I did some mining, I did some investing, and just a lot of lurking in forums, and then eventually found myself more and more in the areas of building and advising and being, hopefully part of foundational parts of different teams. And so I was with Beam, Beam Mimblewimble, if anybody knows that project. It's a privacy project. It's a foundational part of that project. And then was did some advising for some other projects, and eventually came upon the idea, or came maybe up to Polkadot a little bit late in some ways, but we started thinking about ideas about how can you get off-chain information automated on chain and running smart contracts in an efficient way. And ideas about oracles and stuff like that, which is price feeding, is a price feeding use case.
Mhm.
And that was like the basis of starting Kylin. Was let's operate a more efficient Oracle service on Polkadot, and that was like the start of it. And then it's iterated much more since, and we can get into aspects of that. But that's basically my background in forming Kylin in like the really long version.
Hmm. Well, that's a great answer. And I think it's so important. And I'll tell you, part of the reason I wanted to find you and ask you to come on was because I had come across some of your other interviews. Um, and I always ask myself before I invest in a project, do I believe in the founder, right? Because the idea of decentralization really is what is appealing to me, right? I'm a Bitcoiner at heart, right? But I justify holding my other coins because at the end of the roadmap, decentralization is the key, right? Is the goal. So I ask myself, do I believe in the founder to get it there, right? Because you got to kind of hold it together and flourish it until it can kind of raise it pretty much like and it could go do its own thing, right? um, so when you were just talking about some of the rabbit holes you fell down in your inquisitive nature and learning, I really feel like that's a positive sign. And some of the other things that I heard you talk about was something called D-data. Can
Hmm.
you talk a little bit about what D-data is,
Hmm.
and compare it a little bit to uh, today's standard definition of Oracle, right? Because you mentioned just now oracles right now are price feeding, but you have a vision that oracles can evolve into more. Can you talk a little bit about that,
Oh yeah, I'd be more than happy to.
please?
And also, I really appreciate kind words about feeling more affirmed and seeing me in interviews. I mean, like it just as sort of a digression on that point. It's just projects are hard, and I've failed probably more than I've ever succeeded, right? And it was a lot of failures that brought us to the learnings that we all have, even in other core team members. Have all been through a lot, and we've been in the space a long time, a lot of ups and downs. So yeah, I really take that kindly. Thank you, and I hope that comes through in interviews, that we're pretty experienced and pretty passionate when it comes to this space, and also our grounding in history and crypto and in the space. So D data is actually, I think it's a term I came up with, or we came up with. I want to give credit to the team for validating the idea, because I was like, I think like we've got DeFi, but there's really no word that is the right word for what Kylin Network is sort of up to. There are these sort of like conceptualizations that kind of capture a part of it, but they don't really capture like the vision that we're trying to create in many ways. Certainly, oracles are a feature of D data, but D data is not like a feature of Oracle. So Oracle fits into a D data vision where you're automating aspects of smart contracts by echoing financial instruments in the traditional world. But it's not it's expansive enough of a concept to capture how we see the world changing in the next 5 years. We really see that there's going to be I really expect that there's going to be a flipping of the script of what the basic business model is of the internet, and not only a flipping of that script where people are no longer really basically the products, but the producers in many ways of, and in some ways consumers, but the producers of the value of their data. Right now, the main beneficiaries of data are these centralized large companies, and a company like Amazon has a higher GDP than, I think it was like 27 nation states. So I think that this is an endemic kind of like problem of the internet, where the internet's kind of like operating in this way that it wasn't initially intended to operate. It was, when the internet first started, it was operating as sort of this decentralized network. But pairing capitalism, by the way, I think is so far the most efficient system out there. Late capitalism is working okay in terms of meritorious production, but obviously it's like the worst best system we have.
Right.
But and that paired with emerging technology of the internet, and the fact that there's no trust layer of the internet in the 20-30 years it's developed. In addition, that meant that the trust layer of the internet is essentially is companies, right? Is the brand identity of a company, really. And I think that that's about to change, and that has really large implications. And that change, I think, will be brought on by this vision of D data, right? Does D data, is it Kylin going to be the only D data company? I really doubt it. I hope not, right? Because it should be worked on by many different great minds and people. But our vision is that in order to kind of like in order to have that vision operational, you need some tech foundation, some infrastructural tech that will undergird that, just the same way like stable coins and dexes were kind of like operating in earnest 2 or 3 years ago, and nobody really thought much of them. I really expect that this concept of D data is happening in that way right now, where you've got this idea of enabling the decentralization or P2P relation of data, right, where it can be operationalized and monetized in ways that it's never been operationalized or monetized before, right? And that's sort of like the vision of D data. Now that D data, yeah, like I said, it does include things like Oracle stuff because that's a form of data, right? Price feeds are a form of data that can be worked through, or that can be supported by a consensus layer and then pushed through to automate, smart contracts like Aave and Compound with Chainlink. But there are all these really I wouldn't say like much more interesting uses of decentralized data, right? Could you, for example, could you upload your genome, and could you get a personal capitalization from researchers accessing your genomic information? Well, like turns out you probably can, because it's an operational business model as we speak. It's just centralized. Like 23andMe use your genomic data, and they sell it to researchers right now on the back end. And a lot of people don't realize that, but it's a big revenue generating aspect of their business model. Why could that not be, and this is very interesting for individuals, because it's like, why could that not be a capitalization coming back to me, right? Like if I share my genomic data, then wouldn't that be cool if there's a decentralized data market for genomic data, and I upload that through some intermediary and some, in some way that respects my privacy and anonymity, and then I get paid for it, right? Like these, this is, this like very sticky example that a lot of people like to hear about, but there are numerous other examples, and they're really only limited by the imagination. And Kylin, I really like Kylin because, we're not the only data game in town when it comes to crypto, if you want to call it that, but we are the only one, I think, that it allows a ton of flexibility, expression, and imagination in terms of what somebody can come up with in terms of being able to call a validated API, which means if you can call any website, or basically you can call any website, and that the information that's called from that website or that data source or that API is going to be valid because it's running with the consensus layer of Kylin network underneath it. You don't want to just like willy-nilly call any API and then use that information, right?
Right.
At the same time, every traditional company, if you're looking at it from like that legacy or traditional business model example or traditional business example, every single company has data that they either want or that they can share in a remunerative way. Right. And so, like I think we hopefully will be part of this D-data vision or revolution that I see happening in the next 5 years. And I really, when we were approaching investors for the project, one of the things I talked about, and I think people were able to understand, was using the DeFi example, which was to say, hey, like, remember, like, in 2016, 17, 18, and 19, we just had Bitcoin and ETH or whatever just sitting in our wallets. Now we expect yield. Like if you don't get yield, then like what are you doing? You're wasting your life, right? Like you're wasting your assets.
Right.
It's idle. It's an idle asset that you have. In the same way that you had these idle assets back then, I mean, I really think we have idle data right now, right? Like why could you not monetize your data in some way, shape, or form?
Right.
Whether you're an individual or a business, it's just another rev gen. And this all obviously opens up all sorts of like efficiencies, right? For example, machine learning has a real bottleneck right now because of data siloization. Like machines can't learn how they need and want to learn to enable this whole sci-fi, idealistic picture that we have where we can do like Ask Jarvis, like Iron Man. Like that's not going to happen until we unlock data or we unsilo data. So there are these broader efficiencies that could potentially, could potentiate as a result of having the data be a thing, right? That's so when we talk about D data, this is all to color the picture of what we mean by D data. D data is, it's to sum up, it's off-chain information that is powering automations and smart contracts, right?
Right.
And validated off-chain information above and beyond just the financial or price feeding use case. Like the next, we've had DeFi, then NFTs, and I truly, truly believe data is
Right.
next, right? Is this unlocking of data, right? So that's basically what we mean by that.
Yeah, and I really the genomic example you gave, that's a really deep one, because the easy one, like the low hanging fruit, would be the marketing data, right? Like Facebook and Google, right? They sell our data. Are you saying that a guy like me can collect my own data and potentially put it in a marketplace one day? If other people find it valuable, they can purchase it, and I could become the beneficiary of my own data, opposed to something like Facebook or Google or some of these other applications that we use today on Web 2. Is that something is that real? I could possibly do that?
I mean, today, is it real? No.
No. I
Tomorrow.
mean, no.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
know. I'm only answering rhetorically. Sorry.
Okay, yeah.
Today is a real. Note. Tomorrow, is it real? I really think so. I think that as long as there are a few things that need to be built up infrastructurally for that to be a real thing. But absolutely, I believe that that's where we're headed. The key thing about like market data and stuff like that is so individually, like my information, if we're not talking maybe about genome or credit risk and stuff like that, is kind of like not that valuable for most people. But the thing where these companies are really able to monetize and build huge market share, like huge profits, is that if it's super valuable en masse, right? Like it's super valuable when all this individual information is collated and put together, because then I can basically I can get insight into advertisers can get insight into all of these demographic aspects and right? Like so
Right.
so you have to understand, like I think there's an importance in understanding how that works, in the sense that like if like the Brave model, I think it does work and it will work in the long term, but these are really tiny amounts of value that if you were just to say like whatever I like my movements around the internet, am I going to get it's not necessarily like a ton of money on an individual level. And don't mind my my Chorky there in the background. If he relieves himself on air, I do not take any responsibility. That's all him. But what was I going to say? So, but what this would do is it would allow you to be part. If you were part of like you're part of some sort of like network, that we'll say, where you could if you could control your own information, control the journey and how that information is traveling through like Web3. If you had, for example, like a virtualized identity layer, then you could definitely easily see that vision happening, like no issue, right? When it comes to the marketing side, or like genome side, like the genome side, I think is actually really interesting, because people's genomes are actually quite valuable to researchers to be able to work with and on, and I think that what's also neat about that is there's a real leveling, whether you're a wealthy person or not so wealthy, or you live here or there, or whether you're young or old, your genome has like a baseline value that doesn't have anything to do with any of that. So I think that that's like a really neat aspect for if you were to able like to have a D data market based on genomes, and selling them with researchers, or selling access to them rather to researchers. So that could be a really lucrative way. But yeah, it's totally possible. And yeah, like I said, there are a few technical infrastructural pieces that have to get solved. One is the D data markets and validated data. You have to be able to call any data that you want to call, and that data you have to have a sense that that data is accurate and valid. That's what we're doing with Kylin Network. And then the second would be you need, like I said, a virtualized identity layer, because you need to be able to have some sort of like common interoperable reference that says I am this account, or I am this identity, or this person, so that it's always traveling back to, if you wanted to have some individualization of that, like it would always have to travel back to an individual. And like I'm building that with, or we're building that with NFT3, that virtualized identity layer. And then lastly, you need, it may seem like not a big deal, but it is, because you need a trusted computing situation, because data is like able to be encrypted when it's idle or when it's in transit, but when you're working on data, it's exposed. So you need to be able to compute data in an encrypted way. So trusted computing is the third and final piece of the puzzle for these like D data technical infrastructural pieces that have to be in place and working together for all this to happen. So I think the infrastructure will be in place in 2 to 3 years, and then you'll get a story, you'll hear a story or two of somebody getting paid, like a friend, or in your network, all of a sudden they're part of some application layer. They've uploaded their genome that they've got specific access to through their virtualized identity. It's only theirs. They only have custody or control it. And they've gotten some $2,000 or $3,000 payment from a researcher for access to that, right? When those stories start coming out, this D data will truly take off. Or when some application layer develops where or when some company is like, oh, I had no idea if I sold this, that somebody wanted access to this data, and now I'm making 3 or 4% more in profits a year because I've got a revved in line based on the data that I create.
Yeah.
So
now, can I ask you, when you're talking about infrastructure, are you talking about Kylin being on the base layer, basically, of the blockchain? Like, now there's all these layer twos and all this interoperability. What does it take for Kylin to be kind of on the base layer? I mean, is that a long process, or is that the infrastructure that you're kind of alluding to with what you were saying? They need to catch up there before something like that could happen.
Yeah. So Kylin's like a data blockchain in the sense that it's a layer 1 on the layer 0 of Polkadot. And so in that sense, it's its own blockchain with its own consensus mechanisms. So when I talk about other technical infrastructural pieces, definitely I'm talking about other layer 1 technical infrastructures, their own consensus mechanisms, right? And their own sort of what ecosystem they're in or not. I mean, doesn't necessarily matter if we have true interoperability, hopefully through Polkadot or some other platform. So that's what I mean when I'm talking about these technical infrastructural pieces, because you can't have, like, Kylin is not, for example, a virtualized identity network, but it needs a virtualized identity network to find its truest expression. Kylin is not has nothing to do with trusted computing, but it needs a trusted computing platform or network to find its fullest expression. And in turn, those three pieces need each other to find their fullest expression too, right? Because you can't really, like, what's the point of, you would need a decentralized data market in order to work on, monetizing any of this with, a virtualized identity layer or trusted computing. So they're all going to work together, these three pieces, and to analogize like stable coins, dexes, and yield, right? If you're going to make like the analogy to DeFi, right? Like, you need these pieces in place before it all, kind of like before it kind of combusts, right? And in crypto, like, it's not really about killer apps, it's about killer composites. And that means composite technologies working together to end up creating the context for some application layer, right? Like in the past, we had the application layers, like, so we focused on, like, for example, on iPhone ecologies, we're like, what's the killer app, right? What's the killer application layer? But with crypto, we're actually, what we want to look for is the killer composite, the killer composites, I guess, if you want to call it
Right,
that,
right.
right?
Hmm.
So the killer composite for DeFi was stable coins, was dexes, and then figuring out yield, right, which is kind of like the killer, is and that's what really exploded things. Similarly, NFT was brewing for a while too, but we didn't really have that until we had this wider adoption of crypto happening for some years. NFT has been around for a bit, right? But
Hmm.
nobody's adopting it like they are now until DeFi hit, and like so. Um, I think we'll just need a composite of it'll be that composite of technical pieces that will be in place, and then it'll, like, hopefully really
Evolve.
explode, and we'll see these stories, right? It's very
Now,
much, yeah.
sorry, is that why you chose Polkadot, or is that why you chose substrates? Because of the, you know, how the other, you talked about a virtual identity network. I'm thinking of a project like Kilt or something like that.
Yeah, Kilt's great. Yeah.
So is that the benefit of being part of part of a parachain on Polkadot? Because do you get that kind of interoperability with them if both chains, let's say, are parachains on the dot network?
Yeah, so the choice was made really early on to go with Polkadot, because of what we felt was a true technical innovation through their relay chain, um, in the way that they've set it up, in the sense that you have a share. You don't really have to, like, reinvent the wheel every time you want to make a specific, like, or a blockchain specific to the use that it's intended for. For us, we have a data blockchain, so we built the blockchain with that intended use, but we don't necessarily need to, like, we don't have to rebuild a security layer every time, because we have the shared relay of Polkadot. And then underneath it, every time there is a parachain on Polkadot, the overall security goes up, not down, because you're actually, like, increasing the amount of security that the whole thing has, rather than decreasing it by putting any extra, like, load on the system, if you will. So that was so the interoperability was definitely, like, a huge reason to go on Polkadot. The other thing is that we felt that there would be, like, a magnitude decrease in, and we still feel there would be a magnitude decrease in, like, push in the cost of pushing, like, queries and transactions and all these things that have to get pushed through, for a lot of these, for data querying and data feeding. Um, and it could be relatively intensive. So we'd want something that would be cost effective. And initially, we were just thinking about just that price feeding use case when we first started this project, of just oracles and kind of riding the coattails of Chainlink, but doing it on Polkadot and hopefully more cost effectively. And since then we've iterated beyond that, and to say, well, why can't we just automate all sorts of different things, off-chain automations of varying types and stripes, calling APIs, calling data feeds of whatever you want, and just knowing that whatever data you call is going to be supported and trusted by the consensus layer, and also the KYL that's staked underneath it. Because if it's arbitrated in some way that's not good, then you're going to lose your KYL potentially. So, but yeah, the interoperability, I still think that Polkadot's taken a while to get to market. I mean, you can't, like, discount. You can't say it hasn't. Like, it's a reality.
Right.
In the meantime, Kusama, which was kind of, I think, conceptualized as just this kind of, like, wild test network that wasn't going to be as important as it ended up becoming, has become really important. So we may we'll see what happens. We've discussed with the team that at the end of the day, we have to get to an operable like business model for Kylin. So if within a year, in other words, we want data querying, we want um, inputs into the system through data querying, like people paying KYL to get data queries. We want that coursing through the veins of Kylin network within a year from now. So if it turns out that the timing for Polkadot, puts us past a year for Polkadot parachains as opposed to Kusama, then we may revert to going on Kusama, because we have to prioritize, I think, rapid deployment and use case over whether it's Polkadot or Kusama. I mean, we were very careful to note where a lot of developer interest was going, and a year ago, every developer that we were talking to is really, really bullish and keen on building on Polkadot and Substrate, and that's why we chose it.
That's great. That was a great answer too, because I actually had that one of the questions that I got when I was in your Telegram group. A couple of people did ask what the thought process was to launch on Dot and not Kusama, and you elaborated. So that's great.
Yeah, and I guess just as a rejoinder to that, just Dot was also, Dot is a more robust, more highly secure layer 0, and we felt if we're running tons of data that's powering smart contract, we wanted something a little bit more robust. So, but we're seeing that Kusama seems to be pretty robust too.
Yeah,
so,
crazy.
So,
I know. Wow.
Yeah.
Oh, I love Polkadot personally. I mean, the idea anyway, the concept and what's possible with it, right? And I mean, who would have saw Kusama coming? Because they did kind of market it like an innovation hub, right? Like like the Wild West, pretty much, right? And it's grown quite a bit. It's pretty interesting. But how vital is it to Kylin to be in the Dot ecosystem? I mean, can it, because you did say it was a layer 1 blockchain on its in its own right? Can it make it without being a parachain? And what is like your parachain strategy going forward? Like, what round would you anticipate? Let's say best case scenario. Let's say Dot went live this year at some point. When would we see Kylin enter the auction? Like, what rounds, and what would your strategy be to try to secure a slot?
I think, I mean, there's no bones about it. We're highly reliant on the Polkadot ecosystem, whether it's Kusama or whether it's Polkadot, because we're building in Substrate, right? And we've made really great inroads, and we're with the team at Parity, and we've gotten a ton of support from the Web3 Foundation, and we intend to repay that good faith and support as much as we can. There's a tension underlying, like, in some ways underlying the narrative of Polkadot, in the sense that Polkadot is a place where everybody else needs to connect, right? Like where I personally, my analysis, I feel it's still the best. If we have like a multi-chain world, which we will, I still think as soon as Polkadot goes live, it's going to be the best place to be making those connections in the most efficient way possible. But at the same time, so there's this sort of like neutrality or like agnosticism that should be part of being on Polkadot. But because of the tribalism of just humans and people, and because of how speculation drives people to want a zero sum, right? Like if you invest in something, whether or not it's good for the world, you want your investment to be the most dominant thing and the only thing. So that plays a role, I think, in some of these analyses about what, how long things are taking, whether you should be building on this or that, and whether you can live without it or not. Ultimately, you take a risk when you decide on your the ground that you build on. And I am really, I have so much faith and support in the team at Parity and Polkadot. If they take another year, I'd still be okay with it, because ultimately we're not working on video games where if there's a bug, you can get a new you can just download a patch. We're working on ultimately people's lives and their livelihoods and value, and it's and getting it right is that much more important. So if the development path takes a bit longer, I'm totally fine with that. um, and we already have an implementable layer in Kusama if we should decide to go more rapidly in terms of deployment. um, and then when it comes to the parachain question, we knew parachains were going to be a really, really big part of our strategy. So when we were fundraising, we tried to get as many what we call them like dot guarantees as we could, where
Right.
people are guaranteeing that they'd lend us dot for the parachain. A lot of time has passed, so we had to get extensions with those in those deals. So,
Right.
but they're still alive. So we have about close to 200K dot
Right.
that's sort of earmarked for our parachain. And then in addition, I think we've got a market orientation where people see us as, I think, finally see us as like a blue chip project in the Polkadot ecosystem. So the idea that we wouldn't get a parachain if we really tried hard is, I think, a really outside concern. I think we will get it. And which round? I think we're probably best served by going like in a later round, just to like spend our resources wisely and the resources of our community. And how much, what the reward would be in KYL for dot auctions, we've gone back and forth about how we want to undertake that. We don't know quite yet, but I'm no longer, by the way, wearing the crown in Kylin. We've given that crown to actually a community member because we really practice this, what we call DIP philosophy, which is DAO in practice. Although obviously I'm still a key decision maker. But I've expressed the idea I'd like it to be really simple. So you'd get, X amount of Kylin based on, one amount of dot. Would you get? I don't know what it would be at this point, and to some extent this depends on the price of each, right? And it has to be higher than 12%. APY, whatever the reward is, because that's the reward for staking dot. Like, why would you lend your dot that you could just stake for 12%? Right. Like, unless, so yeah, I think we'll unveil it, and you can be guaranteed that whatever the reward for lending your dot for the parachain or Kusama, if we choose that route, is going to be higher than the APY of just staking, right? And there'll also be, we really want to engineer rewards for our community members that have been around for a while, who, for example, may be holding like a Flashfire NFT that was part of the early days that we made those, or even an Adelaide NFT that we made. So we'll be looking at those holders too and see if we can give them a little, extra, because they've been with us for such a long time. And yeah, I hope that answers all that.
Sure does. Yeah, well, that's actually, I have two more questions for you. One of them was, do you know about when you would release the crowd loan details? Like, or is that approaching, or is that still some time away?
So, like, I would hate to release the crowd loan details if they have any like inflexible basis, because then it's like then we've changed it. I would much rather like release it closer to the date of the crowd loans, because, well, first of all, we haven't decided whether or not we're gonna do Kusama or Polkadot. As I said, our strategy there is like, if it's going to take a year before we can get this really operational, then then we would want to prioritize going on Kusama. So that would actually mean just a real shift of strategy. And then that means a Kusama loan. That means our dot guarantees can't be called in because they're dot guarantees. So it's like a lot of things to consider. Yeah, but I can say that we would have a month prior to the auction where we would communicate that with the community, let them know what the process is, the expected rewards of lending, so that we can get our pair chain, and whatever the terms are surrounding it. We would give ample time, 30 to 45 days, for people to prepare.
Okay, and the DDMO initiative, can you just tell us a little bit about what that is and what's going on?
Yeah, so the DDMOs are actually, it's like kind of like it's there's a lot of moving parts to the DDMOs, and it's sort of hard to put into like a soundbite of what it is. But really, it's a way to get the demand side of DData met. So I guess this was like 4 months ago-ish. We started to realize like the supply side of DData is not the hardest aspect. It's actually the demand side. Who's going to be buying this data? Who's going to want this data? How do we find those? We can find the people who want to supply data, because everybody accepts that there's idle data, right? Like I think people accept that, but then who's going to buy it? Who's going to use it? And if you want to power these like Web3 use cases that are sort of seem like sci-fi, like tokenizing your genome or whatever, getting all that, you actually need to have the application layers in addition to the markets, right? Like so the idea behind DDMOs was, okay, let's DDM stands for Decentralized Data Market, by the way, or DData Market, and DDMOs, DData Market Offering. And the idea behind that was, let's look at operational DData markets right now and see what they're doing. So Ocean Protocol was securitizing data tokens. So they're basically saying each data market is a data token, and then ascribing sort of value to that. So and how is that going for them? It's really, and it seems to be going in earnest for them. And I think part of the reason why is you don't have use cases driving like the need for the data. So DDMs were this idea of like, okay, right now, no like normal person who's not a dev could potentially access the business module of Kylin, right? Like you can't really access the query fees that are coming to the business module of Kylin unless you are, feeding that data as an entity that has data to feed. You've written the Oracle scripting parameter, or you've written the Oracle scripting parameter. Those are like the only two ways. So how do we kill a whole bunch of birds with like one stone of solving this like demand that we need? So we need to drive demand of these DData markets that we're envisioning. We need to better involve like individuals into the business side of Kylin. And we need to create the context for kickstarting these data markets themselves. So the idea was born of representing a data market with a single NFT, which acts almost like, if you will, like a taxi medallion, or a way to work the streets, if you will, of whatever data city you're in, right? And that would afford you exclusive rights to that NFT, affords that data exclusive rights to data querying fees for that data market. And also, as part of the sale of that DDMO, right, which is a public thing, whatever money goes into that sale is used as a way to to fund whatever venture arm of that data market is, right? Like, so if one of the first proposals we've gotten is for on-chain analytics, so that would be used ostensibly if $1 million goes into that NFT, that's used to a portion of that is decided on by the fractionalized NFT holders to hire people to work on that use case, right? And every time that is queried, they would be getting a portion of that query fee. We'll have more, I think, a good amount of more detail, but the first DDMO is gonna, we just hooked up with Edgeware and Commonwealth Labs, so we have a voting governance platform now for Kylin where we're gonna be voting on the first one out. That's like, we're supposed to announce that tomorrow, so, or maybe later, early next week. Sam, don't kill me. Yeah, I think that was the idea behind DDMs and DDMOs, and I really I think it came from a point of like exasperation where we had all these partners and a lot of people interested, and a lot of people interested in like what are the use cases, and realizing we couldn't kickstart every single use case in every single data market and have a Kylin network can't be like necessarily, like, I don't think it should be some sort of 1,000 strong consortium like consensus or something that's like trying to like in-house control the IP, do everything. I think we need to just kind of like seed it, and that was the idea behind DDMs and putting it into the control of community. What I've learned and what we've learned with Kylin is like the more that you can meritoriously put control and resources in the hands of community members, and by meritoriously I mean it, you can't just give it to anybody, but the more that we can do that, the better. And it's really served our community and our project well. We've implemented so many ideas that have come straight from just community members, TG members, just saying, hey, wouldn't this be a good idea? And we've done it. And some ideas have been put forward by ourselves, like DDMs, but many ideas put forward by community members. And that's just part of that broader narrative of DAO in practice.
Congratulations too. I read recently that along with one of your partners, the Star, you guys were the first to achieve the XCMP, which is cross-chain mechanism paletting. Is that? Can you tell me a little bit about that? What that is exactly, and how big is that? How big of a deal that actually is? It's like, as an average person, like I read that, I'm like, it's what does it mean though?
It's sort of like looking at a bunch of guys like reading like some sort of like nerds reading a paper. They're like, oh my god, and you're like, what?
Yeah.
Okay, that sounds good. But yeah, okay. So in terms of framing it and its importance, so XCMP, like cross-chain message passing, is like, that's sort of like a major reason for Polkadot existing, right? Which is this interoperability between chains on Polkadot, and eventually interoperability. Can you hear me? I probably sound horrible right now.
Yeah, but I can hear you though. It's okay.
One sec. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. If my sound quality is horrible, I apologize. We've been talking so long today, I ran out of juice on my AirPods. Yeah, sorry, I totally lost my train of thought here. What was the last question about? My apologies.
XCMP.
So yeah, XCMP, and so cross-chain message passing is basically the reason for Polkadot existing. The idea of being able to interoperate with other chains on Polkadot and interoperate with other chains outside of Polkadot through bridge chaining. XCMP.
Sound went out. Can't hear you.
Okay.
Your sound's not coming through.
Okay, 1 second. 1
second. What's up, everybody? Make sure you guys smash that like button. Remember, this is not financial advice. This is a live stream with Kylin Network founder and CSO Dylan Dewdney. He's been a great guest so far. So make sure you guys smash that like button. And also, all the links are in the description for Kylin, all the social medias, the website. Make sure you guys read that white paper. Really fascinating stuff. And hey, Dylan, you back?
Sorry for that.
Wait, I don't know. Audio. Hey, Juan, do you hear my audio or just is Dylan's audio the only one? Because somebody's saying that they don't hear anything. Do you not hear me too? Oh, okay.
Can you hear me at all now? Sorry about that. My AirPods died.
No, he should be good. Are you there? Can you hear me, Tyler? Yeah, I can't hear you. Okay, yeah, they say, I don't know. No good? They're dead? Oh, okay, they're charged. So yeah, all the links are in the description for everything for Kylin. So make sure you guys check that out. I found the white paper extremely fascinating. So make sure you guys go into the links, go to the Kylin.network, I believe, and read that white paper. Another interesting story that I saw, Dylan alluded to it a little bit throughout the interview. He talked about how DeFi started roaring. That wasn't an original feature. Earning yield wasn't an original feature of Kylin. They went out and did that. I thought that was really cool as well. They went out and found a way to make that happen for token holders. So I thought that was a really cool thing. A lot of positive signs. Another thing as well is Dylan's the founder, was the CEO, and one of the questions hopefully he can answer in a few minutes was he stepped aside and the lead developer named Sam Elamine, I believe is his name, is now the CEO of the company. So it seems like a really cool story. No egos involved, right? Trying to accomplish something really fascinating and that I think the world needs.
Hello?
Decentralized data is the concept is amazing, powerful. Just some of the concepts that Dylan was talking about throughout the interview. Really, really powerful, incredible stuff. And that's the reason that I'm so excited about it. Dylan, is your headphones back?
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Let's see.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Turn the mic all the way up.
Hello? 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 Hello?
You're hearing Dylan now? Somebody said they could hear you now, but I can't hear him. It's more important that they hear. So if you could hear them, Dylan, we were talking about the XCMP. Let's see if I can see this.
Yeah. Apologies on that. And so I actually used up all the batteries on my AirPods. So I've switched to my second pair of AirPods now, and hopefully there's no more interruptions. So XCMP. just to give some more color to the viewers, it's like, it's basically the reason for Polkadot existing. The idea of being able to interoperate with other chains and eventually to other chains in Polkadot, right? Other layer ones connecting to the layer 0 of Polkadot, and then also chains outside of Polkadot that are bridging into Polkadot. It's through XCMP, or cross-chain message passing. So what Sam had achieved, and I want to give credit really to Sam in this, as much as anyone, because he was really driving this on his end. So what he achieved was being able to call in Substrate, there are these palettes, like you can call different functions of different chains through palettes, right? So you can say, I'm going to call the function of Astar's chain to do XYZ, basically on my own chain, right? So this is like a really key piece, a really key innovation and key piece of technology that we had to prove out. There's really little to no documentation right now for XCMP because it's so new and it's so cutting edge. I think Sam did just has done an amazing job of basically furthering the state of the art for cross-chain message passing for Polkadot, right? Like not just as a function of Astar for Kylin, but like it's really like a key innovation for the entire ecosystem. And why it's important is, imagine if you could just call any function of any chain and use it under the consensus of your own like chain, right? Like that's actually pretty cool. And there are all sorts of reasons for doing that, and it was a highly like important kind of technical innovation that I think will, or it's a highly important expression of the technical innovation of XCMP. So I think that's like where to start from in understanding why it was a big deal. If you didn't know why it was a big deal.
Well, I read, I guess Gavin Wood posted a Medium blog a couple of days ago, XMP.
Yep.
And it was the first time that I familiarized myself with it, because I don't have a strong computer background at all, really. I kind of got into crypto, Bitcoin Standard, and then you kind of elaborated a little bit earlier about how sometimes you fall down these rabbit holes in the internet, Here we are.
Here we are.
This is the result of a rabbit hole I fell in. This interview right here. That's about it. Before we finish, though, you were part of another project called NFT3, and I really thought the ideas, I don't know much about it, but the idea, the concept, unbelievable, incredibly powerful. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what that is, and then right after that, we're going to wrap it up.
Yeah. Super happy to speak in my capacity for that project as well. And just to allay any, like, if there are any reservations, I'm still, obviously deeply involved with Kylin. But, for us, it was really important to put our Kylin where our mouth was, if you will, and install and work on this concept of DAO in practice, right? And put community members in key positions for Kylin Network. And part of that obviously was, we ended up finding this great person and Sam, who's, I think the future of Kylin belongs to developers, and he's the best person to be leading. That transition period is gonna be about 3 to 6 months or so, and we're in month 1, I guess. But yeah, just so there's no reservations, I'm not like, I'm still very much involved in Kylin. I will be for probably years to come. But my day-to-day is more and more involved, yes, with NFT3. But I am on a foot on each ship, right, on each boat right now, to be honest. I'll be honest. But NFT3 is really neat. I guess it started from this idea of this maybe naive idea. I didn't know it was naive at the time. I thought it was a really great idea. Like, wasn't that a great idea? but it was this naive idea, if you will, of like having identity associated with an NFT, like right, like NFTs are unique. In my brain, it was like, okay, NFTs are really unique, and guess what? So are people. So why not have, in some way, shape, or form, like an NFT be representative of one's identity? And it started from the question. A lot of this stuff does, like, well, why doesn't that exist? Like, that should be a thing. And I actually presented the idea a bunch of times publicly in AMAs, just as a digression. And everyone was always like, yeah, that sounds good. That would be, I'm surprised. I'm sure it'll be done. Somebody will do it. Right. And 9 months later, like nobody had done it. And so I was like, okay, enough. Like, I started to key in on Sam. I felt like he was going to be a great person to lead, Kylin. And so, I felt like okay with starting to conceptualize NFT3 because I felt we could put it in Sam's hands and it would be fine. And so we started conceptualizing, validating NFT3 with people who are far more expert and smarter than I am in that field. Turns out NFTs are actually like to make them representative of identity. It's actually maybe kind of like a terrible idea because, like, at least in the way that I was conceiving of it at first, because NFTs are immutable and one's identity is not immutable. It's changing, right? Like all the time when we want to share certain parts of our identity, certain parts we don't want to share. Do you want your identity to be immutably on a blockchain? It's an NFT. Maybe not in the way that I had first conceptualized it. I talked to a really great expert in the field named Evan, who's our chief advisor for decentralized identity. And we started validating through potentially using a technology called DIDs, or decentralized identifiers, which are an emerging standard for the entire world, the entire web. So the last time the World Wide Web Consortium, or W3C, approved a standard was like HTTPS. So that gives you some framing on the like gravitas of the DID standard and what it means. So it's this big standard that's getting developed, but there's no real adoptive vehicle behind it, we think. And so the sort of thesis of NFT3 is, let's get the DID standard happening, and work on the infrastructure for a virtualized identity layer, but use the adoptive vehicle of NFTs, because we've seen that NFTs are tangible, people like them, and your grandma will have an NFT before she has like an Ethereum wallet, even though she needs an Ethereum wallet to have an NFT. So the or I think some wallet, but so NFTs are this really like great way of working up through adoption, and that's kind of like the basics of NFT3. There are a whole bunch of other great aspects of it that are unlocked when you get into virtualized identity layer. Like you can start to think about end credit. You can start to think about some of the things we were talking about before, like personal capitalization of aspects of you, right? If that's you're uploading your genome to a D data market, well, you need that to travel back somewhere. Or maybe it's just as simple as not having to do KYC every time, because you can have one attestation, right? Like one verifiable credential, one handshake, if you will, with your DID that's within your NFT. And as long as you have your DID and you control your DID in your NFT, then you just share that DID, right? Like you don't need to share anything about yourself. You just share your decentralized identifier with multiple like KYC. Like you don't have to KYC every time, right? Like they already know that you KYC because you have the handshake of your DID with that first attestation of who you are, right? You have a proof of that on chain. So these are all the really, really like great ways to think about like how a virtualized identity layer could work really well. We're not the only ones working on virtualized identity layers, or a virtualized identity, but we are the only one that's using NFT as an adoptive component. And I think that that's going to be a really key differentiator for our project over others. And we have, I think, a really great team forming behind it. And obviously, you know, we have a bit of a proven track record with Kylin. And then there's the idea of it all interoperating really well, right, synergetically. So I'm excited for NFT3, and I'm excited to see if it gets the level of adoption that the DID standard needs to become a standard, and for Web3 to become a thing, because Web3 also isn't a thing until there's a virtualized identity layer either, right? Like you need this, like this needs to happen and for the whole picture to take shape.
Right.
So
Is there
we're,
a token
you know,
for NFT3?
yeah, it's called ISME, ISME. So
What is it
the
again?
ISME, ISME,
ISMP.
ISMME. So is me, like NFT3 is me. It's the sort of the marketing,
Cool.
right? Because, you know, we really want people to have the sense that if, you know, that when they stake, you know, is me within their NFT3, they have, they're going to be alive, really, in a way, in Web3, right? Like that's when you can activate your, you know, your ability to personally capitalize on all these different aspects of Web3, whether it's in terms of your data journey. Like every person will have a data journey, and every person will have some amount of personal capitalization as a result of their data journey, depending on what they share, depending on what they want to share, depending on how they connect, you know, for example, their social media profiles into their NFT3 that will have a different bearing, how much you can buffer your credit, for example, if you have a higher amount of ISME staked. You know, with DEXs, could you get discounts because the DEX knows you're real as opposed to a bot? Absolutely, you could. Do DEXs want real users? Absolutely, they do. Does everyone want real users? Absolutely, they do. Like no one's really solved for real users on the internet.
Right.
Anything a human can do, a bot can do on the internet.
Pretty much.
So
right?
solving for that alone is actually a big deal. Just to have a further assurance that someone's real, and that's also part of NFT3.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, Dylan, thank you so much for joining. I thought it was a great interview. I really enjoyed talking to you. I wish you all the luck
It's
in
my
the world.
pleasure.
You know,
Thank you.
I'm a big supporter, and I'm definitely going to be looking
really
into more
appreciate it.
for NFT3. You know, I'm very fascinated in that.
Cool.
Looking into it.
Join it. Yeah, I can't remember if you're in the TG yet, but if you're not, you need to join. I'll link you. Or should I put this? I'll put this link in here.
Oh, actually, hold on. I'll sign off. We'll talk in 1 second. All right, guys. Thank you so much for watching. Please smash that like button and subscribe. All the links for Kylin Network is in the description. Follow me on Twitter at MJF_invest, and follow Dylan on Twitter at Dylan Dewdney. Just your name, right?
Yep, that's my name.
Dewdney.
Yeah, if you like. Or
thank you guys for watching.
Awesome. Thanks.